Hello and welcome to this week's myNewsWrap, news from the world of SAP, of Microsoft and the world in between. So let's dive into the topics of this week. Let's start with the Business Technology Platform. There is one blog post that I would like to highlight that focuses on the Cloud Foundry event mesh. And to be more precise about how to share event mesh instances across several Cloud Foundry spaces and even sub-accounts. So as you know, when you have been working with the Cloud Foundry runtime, it's not optimal from a developer's perspective on how you can bring things together because this stuff is quite isolated and maybe you want to share, for example, one event mesh instance across several sub-accounts. This blog post now guides you through how to set up this requirement or how to fulfill this requirement by deploying event mesh to one sub-account and then accessing it from other sub-accounts or spaces. The example references a Java app. So what do you have to do in order to bind your Java app, or to be more specific, I think it's a Spring app, to your event mesh that's deployed within one sub-account. I think quite helpful. It's one of the best practices for SAP BTP. So if you're using event mesh, if you want to share the instance, then take a look at this blog post as this will guide you through how to set things up. Then I have another blog post touching the area of the Cloud Application Programming Model by Tobias Steckenborn, who brought out several blog posts, and this is now the latest one, around how to get started with the SAP Cloud Application Programming Model. And this one focuses on REST requests. There's also a short video referenced. So if you start with SAP CAP, if you want to take a look at how you can call to the outside world making use of REST requests, then this blog post and the video might be quite helpful. However, as Tobias also states within the later section in the blog post, it's a very basic walkthrough. So there is, for example, no authentication covered for the outbound call. So in reality, you will have to do a bit more in order to make things work. Then from the Cloud Application Programming Model to Kyma, there is one update from the Kyma team around eventing. So as you certainly know, or you might know, the eventing within Kyma is based on the NUTS component. So all the built-in eventing infrastructure is using NUTS. Now you might want the SAP event mesh in order to do the eventing, and within the help.sap.com article that I referenced, you are now guided through how to switch from NUTS to the SAP event mesh. What do you have to do? And if you would like to switch back, that's also covered within this short overview on how to do eventing within Kyma. So another nice addition to the Kyma functionality. Great that that's covered within the help.sap.com documentation. Then one last news from the area of SAP. In the last podcast, I referenced the open source webinar about Gardener, the project by SAP, open source project by SAP, in order to manage Kubernetes clusters across different infrastructures. And that took place this week. And in case you missed it, the slides as well as the recording is already available for replay. So if you missed it, I think that's definitely worth watching. With that, we will leave the SAP world and switch to the Microsoft world. There is one blog post that I would like to bring to your attention, covering the Azure SDK, which is currently available in beta, so the Azure Function Extension Library. which helps you with dealing with storage, event hub, service bus, or event grid from out other Azure functions. Especially setting up, secretless systems. So really secure secretless systems. And well, this extension really helps you with that. And this blog post that I referenced guides you on a real life example based on an IoT scenario through how to use it and how to set up things. It's taking or making use of the Azure Digital Twins and leverages the SDK together with Azure Functions in order to propagate data updates from digital twins. And this blog post really guides you through all the setup, starting from the digital twins, how to set up the event hub that fetches the data, and then how to propagate the events to Azure Functions. So really, really interesting read. Highly recommend it. Then this week there was a Q&A or an interview of the InfoQ with Jeff Holland, who is Director of Product Management of the Azure Application Platform at Microsoft. You certainly know Jeff from Azure Functions or from Kida talks at KubeCon. And he had a little Q&A about what's the way forward with respect to the application platform and the Kubernetes space. So with tools like Azure Arc, you can now deploy several app services like Event Grid, like functions, like Logic Apps to Kubernetes. And Jeff Holland laid out a bit the motivation of Microsoft, why they are doing it, what has already been achieved, and what's coming up. So quite interesting read. And that also clearly shows the strategic importance of this kind of containerized approach for Microsoft to deploy their app services like Azure Functions to a non-Azure environment. Staying within the Azure Functions area, there is one update of an open source tool that I would like to highlight, and that's the Durable Functions Monitor that I have also referenced in several podcast episodes before. There is one really cool update for the VS Code extension, which gives some improvement with respect to the visualization of your flow of your durable function execution. And that now has really the look and feel of app insights. So that's really cool and super helpful if you have more complex orchestrations of durable functions. So if you're working with durable functions, I highly recommend to take a look at this open source tool, because this is really, really, really helpful. And then to the new kit in the serverless ecosystem of Microsoft, namely Azure Static Web Apps, the hot shit out there. There is another video on the Azure Friday series about how to get started with Azure Static Web Apps. Well, it's with Scott Hanselman and it's with Anthony Cho. So what else do I have to say? Pure fun to watch. What can go wrong with those two guys talking about one cool offering of Microsoft Azure? So definitely well spent 20 minutes. Now switching from the serverless world to the container world, what's new in the Kubernetes and container area? First of all, I would like to highlight a Kubernetes blog post about the release cadence of Kubernetes that has changed. Starting with the Kubernetes release 1.22, there is a different speed on how Kubernetes gets brought out. The blog post outlines the new cadence, what has to be expected, when will which release arrive. It also highlights what does this mean for end users, what does this mean for contributors, and what was the rationale behind the decision of the Kubernetes team to adopt this new cadence. So I think quite important if you're working with Kubernetes to have a bit of insight there. Then another blog post, quite interesting, from, let's say, the CNCF lifecycle of projects, because this week Linked, the service mesh Linked, was graduated from incubation to a graduation project. And this blog post kind of tells you a bit what happened and what does this mean, and what does Linked have on their plate in the future. So also interesting read, because I think that's really quite important to understand the different phases of the CNCF projects that are out there, like sandbox, incubation, and graduation. And what does this mean for the project itself? Then let's stay at the pure Kubernetes world. There is one blog post by Thorsten Hans that I also want to mention, and that's how to debug apps within Kubernetes, making use of Bridge, which is an extension for Visual Studio and Visual Studio Code that allows you to kind of debug your Kubernetes app locally, making use of all the stuff that's available within a Kubernetes cluster. So you do not directly deploy your app, but for the app, it looks like it's deployed within the Kubernetes cluster. You simply use all the Kubernetes services, and they get redirected to your local app. This blog post tells you how to do that, how to do the debugging, how to set up everything. And it also brings up some points with respect to limitations that you face when you're using Bridge. So quite interesting article. And then another announcement from, let's say, the bigger ecosystem of Kubernetes, namely Dapper. There is a new version of Dapper available now. It's 1.3 that came out this week. And the release highlight is now that gRPC proxying is enabled. So one feature that was, I think, quite highly requested is now available with the new release. If you want to get more insights, what's in there in the new release, what improvements have been made, and there are quite some, take a look at the blog post that I referenced within the show notes. And with that, I would like to switch to the area of DevOps, and especially to GitHub. There is one overview blog post that I like to highlight from GitHub. Last week, I had the DevOps what, why, and how. And this week, I would like another blog post. I would like to highlight another blog post, which is talking about CI and CD. Again, same structure, the what, the why, and the how, giving you an overview. What is continuous delivery? What is continuous deployment? What are the benefits? What tools can you use? And, well, of course, it's guiding you to GitHub. No surprise on that, but the general overview is quite well written. And then there has been a lot of improvements in the area of GitHub, a lot new features. The first one that I would like to highlight is the actionable tasks that are now available within issues. So you can now break down an issue into several tasks. And that's not only possible on let's say, a one-dimensional level, but you can build up hierarchies. So you can break down an issue into several tasks. And within one task, you can also reference another issue and break that then down again into other to-dos. And they are really linked. So if you close the issue that is referenced as a task within the original issue, then the task gets resolved within the issue. So that's really cool. It's a super short video that I referenced, 4 minutes, so definitely worth watching. Super cool feature from my perspective. Then, well, a big announcement around code scanning integrations with open source security tools within GitHub, or within the GitHub security scan. So there are more than 15 new code scanning integrations available via GitHub Actions, and they are outlined within this blog post what's available now as an additional GitHub action, or what's also kind of complementing the built-in security scanning capabilities of GitHub. And then there is another, I wouldn't say exotic, but I think not that often used feature, I would guess, that has been brought to GitHub. You can now also push a specific file to your GitHub repository that contains all the citations, like scientific papers that you have within your, or that motivated your work within the GitHub project. And you can reference that from the GitHub repository. So you can really point to the researchers and scientists or the work of them that you have used in order to make those things doable that you have done within your repo. I think it's in a quite early stage, so there is APA support. If I follow the Twitter discussion on that feature, BibTech, that you might probably know if you have been working somewhere in a German university, or in general in universities, then this is not yet fully supported, or not supported at all. It's not really clear out of the description. But this, I think, is something that needs to come, because a lot of citations are in that format. So let's see how this will be used. Nevertheless, I wanted to highlight it. And then another, in the truest sense, exotic topic, another Azure Friday episode that came out about quantum programming. As you have probably seen in the last bigger events of Microsoft, they have now Azure Quantum in their portfolio. And they also have a dedicated programming language called QSharp in order to use these quantum computing capabilities. And this Azure Friday episode guides you through Azure Quantum as a hardware that you use, and how you do quantum computing programming on top of that, making use of QSharp. So if you're interested in that one, or if you just want to take a look into that part of Microsoft Azure, then I think this Azure Friday episode is great. Then let's go in between the two worlds. Let's switch to the world in between SAP and Microsoft. There is one blog post by Bartosz Jakowski that I would like to mention. I had already referenced the basic work about the Azure Synapse pipelines that he brought up, the blog posts within the SAP community, as well as the SAP on Azure podcast episode, where he was a guest speaker, where he showed what's behind the Azure Synapse pipelines. And within this blog post, he kind of continues the elaboration, what's possible with the pipelines, what you can do. And this third part focuses on a metadata store, how to extract and store the metadata with those Synapse pipelines from the OData services that are available from your SAP systems. So yeah, to make the story move on and go on, and if you are interested in the Synapse pipelines, then take a look at the blog post. Then something that can support you within the area of Azure Logic apps and connection to SAP RFC modules. There is now a GitHub repo by David Borg on how to make use of or how to use advanced data types like float decimal and other ones within Azure Logic apps when calling SAP RFCs. There is a sample GitHub repository now out there. So I think that's definitely worth a look at, because that's always quite fun when you do Logic apps. And then also the blog post series of Martin Pankratz continues about the BTP private link service. So there are already now 3 parts out there, and I want to highlight the third part that came out this week, which is really cool, and that's what I especially like by about the blog post of Martin Pankratz, is not just showcasing something that is then working in some laboratory environment, and in real world you break your fingers in order to make things work because that's left out. This blog post now guides you to real world problems where you need answers when you want to use BTP private link with respect to your system setup. So the prior blog posts, which were perfectly fine because they were an introduction, focus on I have my SAP system, I have my private link service, and I have my, for example, CPI system sitting somewhere, and I want to connect them making use of private link. Now, that's good for a basic understanding, but in reality, things are different. You have probably several SAP systems, dev, prod, test, stage, whatsoever. And you might also have different CPI setups. You might have different structure, what I mentioned at the very beginning. You might have different sub-accounts, different spaces within your Cloud Foundry environment, and so on. Now, how do you bring those things together? How do you do the private link service implementation when you have such a setup? And this blog post, the third part, perfectly guides you through that scenarios. So there are highlighting of some scenarios, how to basically set that up, including topics like disaster recovery. So really cool. And if you start with private link, with the usage of private link, I would highly recommend to walk through those 3 blog posts and also to the SAP and Azure podcast episode where this thing was introduced, where also Martin is one of the guests. With that, I would like to switch to the area of learning and upcoming events. So this week only learning. There is one webinar series that started this week on July the 27th, but I'm sure you can still sign up. And that's about Kubernetes clusters and how to run them like a pro, as the webinar is called. If you are working with AKS, if you're working with Kubernetes, I think this webinar, especially if you start working with them, this webinar can give you quite some clues and help you to get a quick start on this topic. And then another thing that was mentioned by one of the cloud solution architects of Microsoft based in Germany, Christian Denig, who together with his colleagues updated the Azure Developer College and, well, brought it to the newest stuff within the Azure and Microsoft ecosystem, namely Bicep, namely GitHub Actions, and a lot of other new cool things. So they are currently reworking their training program and bringing in all those nice new cool features. Now, if you don't know that training program, it's anyway linked within the tweet that I have referenced, but I also have brought in within the show notes a dedicated reference to the Azure Developer College, which is completely available without any fees. So you can just access it and walk through a 7-day course on your own, which might be a bit harder than have the guidance of the cloud solution architects about Azure fundamentals, development, data AI, and so on, up to the topic of Kubernetes. So up to now, not everything I think is updated to the latest and greatest stuff, but that's going on, coming up. So that's really great to see. And with that, I have one more thing that I would like to mention with respect to news to this week. With respect to developer productivity, in case you're using a Windows machine, in case you have not yet touched the Windows subsystem for Linux, because you think the installation is too cumbersome, maybe that's the case. Now you have no more excuses because there is a new way in order to install the WSL on your Windows machine. Those guys who have been on the Windows Insider preview builds, they already had that option, and that was now downported to the GA Windows version starting with 2004. And now you can just install WSL by one command. It's WSL -- install. So that's really the shortest way how to install it, and no more excuses, not to use WSL. With that, I'm at the end of today's session of myNewsWrap. I hope I had some news for you. Some service announcement for the upcoming 2 weeks. I will be on vacation, not next week, but the week after next week. So maybe there won't be a video next week. There will certainly not be a video in the week after next week. So just watch out what I will be promoting on Twitter and LinkedIn. Probably next week it will just be a GitHub repo, but stay tuned. You will see what will come. With that, I wish you a nice rest of the weekend. I wish you a successful, nice next week. And see you soon. Until then, bye.